So, good afternoon and welcome to today's briefing titled Progressive Priorities in the Farm Bill, presented by the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. My name is Ricardo Pacheco, and I am a Senior Legislative Affairs Associate at the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, and I will be moderating today's panel. Thank you all for joining us. As we get started, please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love for you to know which office you are from, as well as your name, your pronouns, and honestly, anything else you would like to share. So before we get started, I do have three brief housekeeping notes. First, we are going to dig deep into policy discussions today, but we will not engage in electoral or partisan conversations during this session. Second, we've also enabled automatic closed captioning. If you go to the bottom of the screen and click on live transcript, you can enable the closed captioning. As it is AI, it is often imperfect, so we'll also be adding improved captions before we send a video of this event to you later next week. Lastly, we also encourage you to ask questions of our incredible panel throughout the event. You can drop your questions in the chat or in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to provide some background for today's call. So the Farm Bill happens once every 5 years. It's prepared by the Senate Agriculture Committee, chaired by Senator Stabenow, and the House Agriculture Committee, chaired by Rep. Glenn Thompson. The 2023 Farm Bill is one of the few pieces of legislation that is expected to actually pass Congress this year. Additionally, the Farm Bill spans several traditionally siloed issues, from hunger to climate change to workers' rights. The Farm Bill is a piece of legislation that will impact every district. It is not only meant for rural communities or for farmers. Now, allow me to introduce each one of our incredible panelists today, and then we'll dive right into the conversation because I want to be sure that we leave plenty of time for your questions. And again, remember, you can drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom or the chat box, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So first, it is my pleasure to introduce Gina Platanino, SNAP Deputy Director for the Food Research and Action Center, also known as FRAC, which seeks ways to improve SNAP's reach and support low-income households, including people and families working their way up the economic ladder. Prior to joining FRAC, she worked with the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute and other food justice organizations. Thank you for joining us, Gina. We're also joined by Jake Davis, who is a farmer and a principal with Local Root Strategies. Jake has dedicated his career to building a better farm and food system through market development and policy reform. He's worked with national NGOs like the National Audubon Society, Organization for Competitive Markets, the Berry Center, and most recently as a national policy director for Family Farm Action. He currently farms in central Missouri, producing pasture-raised pork and vegetables. Thank you for joining us, Jake. Next, I am delighted to introduce Patty Lovera, Policy Advisor for the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, where she advocates for family farms, food security, and a healthy environment. Patty comes to the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment after 14 years as a program director with Food and Water Watch, as well as advocacy work with Public Citizen and the Center for Health and Environmental Justice. And last but definitely not least, I want to welcome Kara Boyd, President and founding member of the Association of American Indian Farmers, a national organization that provides outreach, advocacy, and technical assistance across Indian country and is dedicated to preserving ancestral lands, heritage, and regenerative farming techniques while providing families and communities with healthy foods. Kara is a farmer and an enrolled member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. Thank you all for joining us today. So I want to begin with a question for our two farmers, Jake and Kara. The Farm Bill is considered a must-pass bill, but it doesn't tend to make headlines outside of DC. So can you explain to us, why is this bill so important? And what's at stake for you?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having us today. I think there's a couple of important reasons that the Farm Bill is a critical bill to understand. One is sort of, Ricardo, what you've already said, which is that we only get an opportunity to do this once every 5 years. And this bill really shapes our food system. The second is that, unfortunately, the farm policy that we've passed over the last several decades have led to a food system that is incredibly consolidated, and one that favors those producers at the very top. One fact that everyone should walk away with is that somewhere in the ballpark of 80% of our federal subsidies go to the top 10 or the largest 10% of producers. So if we want to level the playing field, if we want to reshape our food system, now is our opportunity to do that for everyone. And for smaller producers like myself and those folks that I work with, this is our chance in this 5-year cycle, and we shouldn't miss it.
Oh, Kara, I think you are on mute.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. As a farmer, the Farm Bill is very important in the funding and that it gets passed, and from a bipartisan perspective, because agriculture isn't partisan. Everybody has to eat, and farmers need these resources for conservation. We need it so that way we can have infrastructure in place. And that's what's key, is passing something that's inclusive and also looking at possibly bringing about some change with policies that are archaic and no longer fit and are in the best interest not only of the farmers but our communities as well, such as the commodity programs, foods that are being sold, things that are culturally relevant, and the nutritious content. So it's far-reaching from the soil to the farmer to the consumers and the marketplaces, so and the economy, because a lot of places are still in rural America very agricultural-based economies. So we need this so that we can keep feeding America.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake and Kara. Now I want to turn to our panel as a whole. The Farm Bill is a vast and far-reaching package, as we know. What are the key progressive priorities for you in the Farm Bill this year? Let's go around the table. I can begin with you, Gina, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ricardo. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. For us, our progressive priorities are based on what we have seen coming from the pandemic, coming from this hunger cliff that our residents across the U.S. are facing, right? Emergency allotments have ended. Food insecurity is the highest that it has been since the pandemic, but the resources that were there are not in place anymore. So we are prioritizing closing the Meal Gap Act, championed by Representative Adams and Senator Krista Gillibrand. Take a better look at what allotments should be. We look at make it easier for individuals who are older adults, people with disabilities, to be able to claim their medical exemptions, and who will push parity so that Puerto Rico can get SNAP benefits. The other priority for us is the Improving Access to Nutrition Act, which will get rid of those harmful time limits, which affects populations across the board, particularly veterans, youth who are aging out of foster care, people who are re-entering society after incarceration, and people with disabilities. This harmful archaic laws instituted in 1996, getting rid of this will be a great progressive priority for us. The other priority for us is making it more accessible for low-income college students to finish education, but not making the jump through barriers to access SNAP. They already have to follow all of the guidelines. Somehow they enter college and they have additional barriers. So the EAT is one of our main priorities. Our other two last priorities are the SNAP Plus Act, which is to end the prohibition for SNAP recipients to be able to purchase hot food. So that rotisserie chicken, if it's cold and uncooked, it can be bought, but the moment that it is hot, not. So this is problematic for our unhoused population, for individuals who don't have their own kitchens, and for people who have disabilities or older adults and lack muscle mass to be able to cook some of these meals for themselves. Additional ones of our priorities is eliminating the the felony ban on SNAP recipients who have a felony, and lifting the bar act for those who are legal permanent residents who have been in the state who have to be in the state for more than 5 years.
Awesome. Thank you, Gina. Patty, can we move on to you?
Hey, everybody. So just really fast, the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment is a coalition. I won't name all the members. We have some national groups and we have some state-based groups from the Midwest. And all of those groups have lots of priorities, have their own portfolio of work, but what brings them together when we talk about the Farm Bill and we talk about federal policy is that there's a lot that needs to change. In our farm policy, we can get at a lot of it in the Farm Bill because it is a big, complicated package. It does a lot of things. And particularly what we're focusing on is there's a bunch of things that should change to stop the going even further into what has become the dominant model of raising animals, which is very large, very industrialized confinement operations that is now the majority. It's not 100% in any sector, but it's damn close in some of them. And it's a terrible model for everybody but the corporations that invented it. So it's animal welfare problems, environmental, it is different. How many animals you raise in one place really matters, not just how many animals you raise. It's where and how you're doing it. It's a whole different environmental profile. It's a whole different animal welfare profile. It's a whole different economic profile for communities, whether you're raising a huge number of animals on one facility or a smaller number on lots of facilities. That's a different rural economy. So there's a million parts of the Farm Bill that impact that. But what I would say our priorities is we have to do some defense. We know this on a bunch of fronts. The Inflation Reduction Act put a bunch of money, a historic amount of money, in some important places to do conservation programs. We need to keep that money there. We need to be smarter about those conservation programs and spread the money out in a more equitable way, and stop writing rules that steer it towards these biggest operations. And when we have a ton of small farms who apply and get turned away. And then there is an opening, and I hope we're going to have time to get to talk about it. We have an opening because of the pandemic and because of the very visible breakdown in our supply chains. It is now widely accepted that a few companies have a disproportionate amount of power at every step of the food supply. You name it, a couple of companies run that piece of the food system. Several of us on this call used to talk to ourselves about that fact, and the pandemic put it on the front page. So what can we do with that opening? So there's a long list of things lots of family farm advocates want to do to kind of, from real specific prescriptions on how some of these companies behave in the marketplace towards bigger, more ambitious things, to make space for independent, regional food systems, independent producers, all those things. So what can we do with that opening that we got because of the very visible meltdown during the pandemic? So that's a real priority for our folks, is what we kind of call competition issues about what we're doing to level the playing field, like Jake was talking about.
Thanks, Patty. Kara, what about you?
Well, for me, it really comes to change. I think that we have an opportunity in this new Farm Bill to foster change, where farmers are often looked at as the problem causers, contributing to the ozone. And so with regenerative ag and emphasis being put towards small scale family farmers who don't have the infrastructure or the capacity or the resources to implement some of these practices, because larger farmers receive the majority of the subsidies, because it's based on base acres. So farmers who farm 10,000 acres get way more subsidy and monies than a farmer, most small scale native and Black minority farmers who have on average 20 to maybe 50 up to 100 acres. And so to me, having a policy, a farm bill that actually is equitable, that looks at those smaller scale farmers who want to be a part of the solution and gives them the tools and the resources to do that.
Thanks. Jake?
Yeah, I want to just echo everything that's said, because all of those things are right and more. I will also just add to that list that we have an incredible opportunity in this Farm Bill to think about how we, there's a lot of discussion about how we create our federal crop subsidies, including crop insurance. And there's opportunities for us to save significant amount of money in the Farm Bill, or utilize that money for other programs if we stop subsidizing, for example, corporate insurance providers in the crop insurance program. So that's another way we can push back on corporations in the Farm Bill. One more I would add to the list of things that we've been talking about is reform to the commodity checkoff program. Many of you may not be familiar with what the commodity checkoff programs are, but they're a mandatory fee that farmers like myself and Kara and others have to pay into, mandated by the federal government. We have to pay that money in, and then they dole that money out to organizations that are often working against our best interest, and that are often showing serious signs of corruption, including, lobbying Congress and a whole range of things that's not sort of beneficial for the future of our food system. That is some of the power that I'm sure all of you see walking the halls on a regular basis. And we need to bring that power in check so that we have opportunities to do more things in the future. And then I think the last thing I'll say to that, and Patty alluded to this, and we can certainly talk more about it as we go, is that for those programs that are really designed to combat, both help farmers be more resilient to climate change, and also to help farmers sequester carbon and be part of the solution to climate change, we need to be really very sure that those programs are going to a diverse group of farmers, and farmers that are not those that just control the vast majority of acres in this country. That we have lots and lots of smaller acre farmers in the country that are not getting access to those federal programs. And really, not only are those programs, just being oversubscribed by the larger producers, lots of times those programs are designed incorrectly for smaller producers. And we need to do more to make sure that the producers, the vast diverse group of farmers are getting access to things like that, that IRA funding to combat climate change.
That's awesome. Thank you all for those, for your answers. And Jake, we're sticking with you for this next question. And I think it's actually a really good segue for this next question is, what do you think are the opportunities to shift support from large, wealthy farms towards, these smaller farmers and those historically underserved through commodity subsidies and crop insurance?
Yeah, so there's some very common sense things that we should be doing in this space. So for example, folks on both sides of the aisle of Congress have advocated for things like ensuring that those folks who get access to crop subsidies are people who are actually working on the farms, right? They're the farmers, rather than either corporate interests who might be acquiring those farms as an investment property, or folks who, live in other places and aren't actively engaged in the process of farming. There's also things that we can do from that perspective on setting limitations, right? Saying things like, billionaires shouldn't be getting farm subsidies, and by the way, many of them are. So we need to be thinking about sort of how we're just setting some limitations about how we're distributing those subsidies. But the second thing we can do, and the one that is sort of a little bit less talked about, is around commodity crop insurance, right? So commodity crop insurance is one of those things that has no adjusted gross income limits. It is overly subsidized premiums to the insurance companies themselves. We've seen examples where some of the agents that are writing the largest policies in the country are making hundreds of thousands of dollars off of writing one insurance policy. So there is a lot we can do to reform those policies to ensure that farmers, by the way, lots of smaller farmers don't actually even use crop insurance because they can't find an insurance agent who will write that small a policy or that diversified of a policy. The last thing I will say on that front is that we also need to be incentivizing diverse production, right? So production of things like food to feed our neighbors, not just a handful of feed grains that feed livestock, right? If we focus on utilizing our subsidy system to create a food system that feeds our neighbors, we can drive down the price of healthy foods for the people in our community, and we can get rid of some of these supports for those factory farms or concentrated animal feeding operations that Patty mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Jake, and that's great too. This next question is also for Patty. Kind of, similarly, Patty, how can the Farm Bill help transition us to something other than, the factory farm livestock production system?
Yeah, so like Jake just teed up, and like I think I mentioned, a minute ago, the vast majority in animal agriculture, the vast majority of that production is happening in very intensive confinement operations that do not look like the picture they put on the package. And so, there's some slight differences between, chicken or dairy or beef cattle or hogs, but the trend has been towards larger, more confinement. And lots of groups have been working on this in many different ways for many years, but we always talk about, we don't have this system because it's the best system that is somehow more efficient or more optimal. We don't have it because rural communities wanted it, or even farmers wanted it. We have it because of who the strongest voices and influencers on farm policy have been and other policies, and that has been large meat packing, egg producing, dairy corporations. There's a million things we have to do to unwind that system, but you can put them kind of roughly into 3 buckets. We could enforce environmental laws. When it comes to animal agriculture, we don't. Another webinar, got to talk about the EPA, but that is a piece of it. But that rhetoric shows up, and it shows up intensely in the Farm Bill debate. That is part of the culture war about you will not regulate us, which is agriculture is very good at doing. So we do have to have that conversation as we do a Farm Bill. The other pieces we can do in a Farm Bill, it's the grain system that Jake was talking about. We put so many animals in one place in this system, you are not producing their feed in that place. You need to bring in corn and soy from all over the place, and it needs to be pretty cheap to supply this system. And a huge portion of the Title I of the Farm Bill, the commodity programs benefit the meat industry that use this system. And then this system has grown at the same time that these companies have grown. So there's an antitrust competition, how are these markets functioning piece of this, and we can take a shot at many of those pieces in the Farm Bill. So real quickly, there is a package that would get at a lot of this called the Farm System Reform Act. It has 3 moving parts. One is stop building new confinement operations by a date, and you shouldn't be able to expand, because a lot of times when they get their foot in the door, it's kind of a medium size, then they expand. So stop new and expanding CAFOs. Part 2 is help existing producers who are caught in that system, whole nother webinar. But once you're in, you're probably stuck because you borrow a lot of money to be in this system as a producer. And the companies are happy to let you have the mortgage, the dead animals, and the waste while they own all the valuable stuff. So we need to transition people to something else so that they don't just exit farming and a new sucker gets brought in to go get a mortgage and get in the system. And then the third piece is, if people are raising animals the right way, they need fair markets that pay them for what it costs to raise animals the right way. So the third leg of that package is dealing with a long list of things that need to happen to take on how these companies behave in the marketplace. That's a great start. There's a bunch of other real specific things we could do in how conservation programs are written. So there's an important program called EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, way oversubscribed, lots of folks apply, and it's hard to get the data, but when you can get the data, in a lot of parts of the country, disproportionate amounts go to manure management on these large confinement operations, while lots of small folks who are trying to get much smaller grants to put up fencing for grazing get turned away. So we could fix things like that in the Farm Bill and use existing money better to support what we want to see instead of what we don't want to see. We can support all kinds of research to help people transition, help them figure out how to do grazing on their land. There's a lot of ways we can help build the alternative. And then there's a whole package of things we could do to take on how these companies behave that have really tilted the whole system towards getting big or getting out. And that's what's brought us factory farms.
Awesome. Thank you, Patty. Gina, this next question is for you. And this is also kind of personal, for me being from South LA, from the city of Compton, which is categorized as a food desert, how can we use the Farm Bill to increase accessibility of nutritious foods for all families, regardless of income or zip code?
Of my video, so hopefully you can hear me this time around. So this is a great opportunity because we don't work in a silo, right? I think our other panelists talk really well about how we are a food system, right? So if we have enough for our farmers to be producing these foods in terms of the nutrition bill, what we can do is putting enough funds in people's hands to be able to purchase this meal, ensuring that people don't have barriers in accessing it, ensuring that those foods that they want to partake are widely available. I mentioned that the restriction on hot meals, and I mentioned that there are certain individuals who are having issues entering the workforce, many of them who are veterans and so on. Putting time limits on those individuals is incredibly harmful. So ensuring that there are more retailers that also take EBT card, and also more producers that also take EBT card and make it more accessible for individuals to be able to purchase the meals in those places.
Awesome. Thank you, Gina. Kara, this next question is for you. Where will the next generation of farmers come from? And what do you think it will take in order for them to be supported and successful?
The next generation of farmers are going to come from the young ones, but it's only if they stop seeing their parents struggle. We won't have that next generation of farmers if we'll continue to see farm foreclosures. When there's money allocated to save these farms, yet the USDA is for some reason not getting those monies to those farmers. I was in Oklahoma last week with a family with 3 children that are next generation farmers, losing 720 acres. They're selling off their cattle, their equipment. So that next generation of farmer is going to come from the students, the youth that are watching the farmers in our community struggle and not have fair payment, to not be compensated for what it costs to produce the food. So that is where the next generation of farmers is going to come from, and how we're going to support them and be able to really encourage them and have that infrastructure and capacity is to make access available to those small scale family farmers that corporate America has been hoarding for such a long time. We must amend federal policies that unjustly protect those corporate agribusinesses, and that 90% cost share, those guaranteed loans that are going to that large scale integrator just to be a part of another system, and that the smaller scale new and beginning farmers, it's good to see that some of the changes coming where they no longer have to have 3 years of on the farm day-to-day management experience. That is such a barrier because if I have to wait 3 years to get a farm loan, I'm no longer a new and beginning farmer. These are the things that we must fix in the next farm bill so that we can have that next generation of farmers, because they're here now.
Awesome. Thank you, Kara. Patty, we're going back to you for this next question. We've kind of already touched about, capturing, methane and capturing gases. So what are the concerns about capturing methane from manure to use for energy? Isn't it a win-win situation to get some energy out of waste?
Yeah, so people may have been seeing this getting, there's quite a hype machine in place for, you can call it renewable natural gas. Sometimes it's called biogas. And it's out there. If you're based in DC, you've seen the ads on TV and buses and whatnot, where, yeah, we know that manure management at large animal operations is absolutely a source of methane. We can't pretend that it's not. So then we have a question about what are we going to do about that? The solution that is coming from the animal ag industry that's running these facilities, that's concentrating that manure in one place, which is creating quite the methane hotspot. And now their friends in the oil and gas industry have decided that the solution is to use enormous amounts of public money and then also whatever else they can get in a carbon offset market to build pretty complicated infrastructure to capture that gas and to take it somewhere to burn it and to call it green energy. So we're not saying we don't have a methane problem. We need to deal with that methane problem from these facilities. We absolutely do, but this is going to be insanely expensive. We're going to use an enormous amount of public money, private money, all kinds of financial, I mean, it is like a lasagna of subsidies to build one of these digesters and the infrastructure to take the gas somewhere. And we're going to lock ourselves into a system that raises animals this way because we just spent a ton of money putting digesters on top of every lagoon where they collect the waste, and then a very elaborate network of pipelines to take it somewhere to burn it. So there's better ways to use that money. There's better ways we could use that investment in real renewable energy, the kind of transition I was talking about a few minutes ago, getting people out of that system and into grazing systems where it's an entirely different footprint. Methane wise, you do not want to live next to a big hog confinement or a big dairy operation, whether or not it has one of these digesters. So I was on the phone with people this morning from Minnesota who are just feeling completely overwhelmed by a big proposal for a big dairy operation to get even bigger, because now they can make money off this gas. And now they're worried not only about what it's like to live next to this big, tens of thousands of cows dairy confinement, they're also worried about this digester, which is very complicated, may explode, and the pipelines that bring the gas somewhere. And it just, the false solution is not a strong enough term for what folks in the countryside are dealing with this. And it's going to lock us into a system we already know we don't like. We don't like a system that raises animals this way. And we don't really want a system that's dependent on burning gas, no matter what the source of the gas is, to make electricity. We can do better on both those fronts, especially with public money. So it's concerning to see all of the hype and all of the greenwashing going on around this.
Thank you, Patty. This next question is for both you, Jake and Patty. So, the pandemic made clear how fragile our food system is, and in no small part due to the heavily consolidated nature of so many elements of the ag economy. Can you walk through some of the proposals that are currently being discussed that would help promote competition and reduce corporate control over our food systems, especially those that actually have a good chance of making it into this year's Farm Bill?
Sure, happy to start, and then Patty will do we'll clean up, I'm sure. I think there's a number of things that we can do on this front. I mean, I think the first thing that we need to do is to be aware that we need to be very defensive when it comes to folks attacking competition rules that already exist. So we just saw in agriculture appropriations that there is an attack on the competition, what we often refer to as the packers and stockyards, or the GIPSA rules that are being written at USDA that all of us farmers have been waiting on desperately since 2008. We're finally at a place where we're getting some rules, and now folks are attacking those rules and trying to prevent them through appropriations measures. So we need to be really defensive about that position and make sure that that doesn't happen, and that USDA can do their work of implementing our country's, our best competition policy for livestock farmers like myself. The next thing that we really need to do is we need to invest in local and regional food systems. So we saw significant investments through the era of the pandemic, through ARPA and through IRA, but we need to make sure that we continue those investments, and we need to find ways to do that. We need to hold corporations accountable. So when those corporations do things like mass depopulation of animals because of they don't have room for slaughter, like in the pandemic, or for bird flu, that federal taxpayers' dollars are not subsidizing that work. Those should be costs that those companies have to bear internally, and we need to make that their responsibility. And I think the last thing I will say in this space is that we really need to look for every opportunity to hold corporate agribusiness accountable in the Farm Bill, and that includes things that we've already mentioned, like checkoff reform, but others, right? There are a ton of things that we can do, and we should evaluate every policy that comes through the Farm Bill with that lens. Are we holding corporate agribusiness accountable for a broken food system that they have virtually created?
Yeah, that's a great list. Let me just add a couple specific examples, because I think that's right. The way to think about it is, for a long, long time, Farm Bill policies were like written by and for, and it gets very entangled, the biggest players. So of course they serve the biggest players, right? So it's time to have that lens on there. A couple specifics I will just tee up is, if people need more information about the role of commodity checkoffs, it is astonishing. It will kind of blow your mind. And we need to, the bill that's in play, the OFF Act, would basically make them follow some basic accounting rules and some transparency when they misbehave, which they do regularly. And they are out there proclaiming to speak for all, fill in the blank, all producers of whatever the commodity is they represent. And, I have membership in my coalition who's regularly saying they don't represent me, but I have to put money into the fund they use to do that thing. So it's literally basic reforms about how they behave. That would be a great start, because they have disproportionate influence in this process of what the Farm Bill will become. Another very specific one, and it's insane that we don't have it, is fixing something we've had, which is mandatory country of origin labeling for meat. It's basic. We know where other things are made, like our clothes and everything else we buy. We don't. We had it for a while, and then we lost it under pressure from the industry because they created a crisis at the World Trade Organization. We can bring mandatory country of origin labeling back. And one, it would be a huge it would be a huge moral victory for American livestock producers who would like to convey that they are producing livestock here. And two, for the few years we had it before the WTO and company shenanigans, people were actually making more money in their markets when they could convey all of the attributes of their product, like where it's from. So that would be a real concrete thing that we could do in this Farm Bill. There's a bill. And then beyond that, we have lots of things we could do to try to intervene in how some of these companies behave themselves in marketplaces. So we could create a special investigator position at USDA to prioritize enforcing a very old but very good law called the Packers and Stockyards Act. We could tell meat packers we will not dive into how meat packers procure their livestock, but let's just say they do not do it with an auctioneer like we all think they do. There's very little actually transactions in a cash market where somebody could bid up what you sell. The role of contracting, which is always going to be geared towards the big buyers, is out of control. It is causing huge economic problems, and it's driving a lot of the consolidation we're talking about. So there's a discussion about what to do about that, particularly in cattle markets. And our folks really would like a much bolder solution than we are currently seeing in that discussion, to say we should be requiring meat packers of a certain size. The biggest players should be in a cash market for some amount of the time to give folks a fighting chance to get the price they need. That conversation has happened. It's not currently happening now. What we're getting is like, well, if we fixed price reporting, then people could decide what day to go to a cash market, to go to an auction, which they probably don't have access to. Like, price reporting is nice. Transparency is nice. It's nice to know if you're getting screwed, but it doesn't stop you from getting screwed. Like, we actually need to take on the behavior of these companies in the marketplace so people have a fighting chance to get the price they need. That's going to take a bolder approach than we're currently seeing. But that's the kind of things we need to do to really deal with the consolidation and how it shows up in producers' lives.
Awesome. Thank you both. Jake and Patty. So we are starting to get some questions into the chat box. Thank you for those. And as a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat box or the Q&A box. So let me go ahead and turn to one of those questions from Ross here at PCAF. How does the Farm Bill affect farm workers and the rights on the job? I'll leave this question open for whoever wants to answer.
Well, I can take a stab at it because, what happens in corporate America, it's greed. it's profit over people. And what we find in these systems is that the people, the workers, usually have very poor work conditions, and their pay is very low. And so by allowing corporate America to set the standards and to set these practices, the Farm Bill actually could come in and we could challenge that and make these farm workers, these large-scale corporate manufacturing facilities, safer workplaces for the farmers, and increase their pay. I find it always amazing when I look at the minimum wage standards, and agriculture is exempt.
Just to add on that, and this is not my expertise, I think I saw somebody, I think UFCW is here in the chat, and they'd be a great one to connect to. It sounds like they have a package of things they're looking at. We do have, and this is very convenient for Big Ag, we do have, this is Congress and there's committees, and there's always a lot of like, oh, that's not us, we're doing this part. But there are absolutely things that could improve things. So there's a bill called the Protecting America's Meatpacking Workers that has it's not farm workers, but I mean, we have an enormous number of folks in the food chain who are working in tough jobs in meatpacking plants, and the biggest players in that industry just want to go as fast as possible. There's a lot of downsides to that, including safety for workers. So, and it came up at a hearing yesterday, with the USDA doing, let's be clear, the bare minimum to rein in line speeds is under attack by some folks in Congress. So there's some real specific things like in the meat industry. And then there are other things, we could be thinking about farm workers as potential beginning farmers, right? Mm-hmm. So what are the barriers in beginning farmer and rancher programs? So, and folks who know how to do it because they're doing it, they're just doing it as an employee instead of, being the owner. Can programs work for them? There's groups, I think, like Rural Coalition thinking about that. So I think there's a lot of ways into it, even though you historically hear, oh, we don't do labor in the Farm Bill, and that's been a convenient excuse. And then the last thing I'll say is again, it gets to committees or whatever, but there's always stuff about just preemption. Like, we're going to have to be on the lookout for preemption. If states, if folks have organized in a state to do a thing affecting agriculture, we are going to see a lot of pressure in this Farm Bill to say, no, states, you can't do that. And that could be about worker standards. It could be about labeling standards. It could be about how we raise animals, but there's going to be a big push for preemption when anything that touches agriculture. And, some states are starting finally to do some things for workers. And that's one more reason to be on the lookout for that.
Ricardo, I'll just add one tiny thing because I know we've covered a bunch there, but we also do a lot from a federal government standpoint with procurement, right? Part of what we buy as American people, the USDA buys a lot of food, and we can set a lot of standards about how that food is produced and processed through our procurement standards. Senator Booker recently introduced a bill protecting child labor and other sorts of labor violations. We also, those meatpacking workers or those meatpacking companies actually rely on USDA for inspection, right? And so we could take their inspection away if they don't treat workers fairly. So we do have a lot of sticks to enforce these labor requirements in the Farm Bill.
Awesome, thank you. This next question is from Jenny Kamara from Rep. McClellan's office. How do you see the Farm Bill being a mechanism for childcare access for farmers and farm workers? And what policy research have you come across addressing this? Does any panelists want to answer this?
Jake, are you going?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing is that so I just convened, not particularly around the Farm Bill, but I just convened and facilitated a discussion on rural policy in general a few weeks ago in Omaha, and a bunch of organizations came together. And childcare access is one of those things in rural America that is very, very difficult to come by. And as our food system consolidates, and as there are fewer farmers and there are fewer small businesses in rural communities, it is very, very difficult to get childcare access in those spaces. And it is a place where we need a lot of investment. I certainly know there are like urban challenges to that as well. But part of what we need to understand is that as the food system consolidates and we have fewer neighbors and grandparents and cousins and other small businesses around to rely on, things like childcare get to be a real challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am out past what I work on, but a big, there's 12 in last Farm Bill, there's 12 titles. We've hit a lot of them, but we probably haven't hit rural development, which is a pot of money, and it's a division, it's a wing at USDA that lends money for lots of things, including businesses in rural areas. So is there a role, in rural development as they look at, and there's all kind, I'm going to mess up the names. There's rural business grants. I mean, there's a lot of potential there, maybe for childcare to be on one of the things that they're trying to bolster in rural communities. I mean, they have rural wastewater, rural housing, rural utilities, and there's also like business and industry loans. So maybe there's something there to look at whether they can be a jump start to getting some places up and running.
Thank you. The next question comes from Trevor O'Connor. Is there a chance in this Farm Bill to push for expansion of urban agriculture? Our district, which is in Louisville, Kentucky, has several urban farmers who wanted to know how we could help. Any panelists want to take that one?
Yes, I think that there is when we're looking at allocation of funding. And the reason being is corporate ag and the way that funding is allocated on base acres, but understanding that there are individuals in New York City making 6 figures on a rooftop. And so making sure that there's access to those funding opportunities, that there is no minimum land size requirement per the FSA handbook. And so making sure a lot of times, we have federal policy, but where the interpretation and implementation comes into play is in the local office. So having a better understanding of what is a farm, who is a farmer, who qualifies for these programs. And oftentimes it's not because that urban farm doesn't qualify, but it's because they don't necessarily know how to navigate that system and how to begin to self-identify, how to file a Schedule F at the end of the year, reporting their farm income, and making sure that your constituents understand the difference between local, state, and federal policies. Oftentimes, small-scale farmers think that because their local county may require them to have 5 acres or more to be a farm to get a tax break discount, that they're not a farmer, when that is not the rule at Farm Service Agency to get a farm serial number. So I think that having that language and those educational opportunities and outreach and direct technical assistance in the Farm Bill allows us to grow that next generation of farmers, and a lot of them coming from those food deserts where they understand the significance and the importance of producing food, who want to maybe relocate to a more rural area and contribute to the process.
I'll just add, yeah, that's all great. I think great advice for navigating. I mean, some of what we end up doing in helping people navigate the Farm Bill feels like just coping mechanisms. I mean, one place to kind of keep an eye out for if you're interested in urban ag, the acronym we use in Farm Bill land is LAMP, Local Agricultural Marketing Programs.
Yes.
See, I don't even know. I just use the acronym. So the LAMP portfolio is a place you want to look. In the last Farm Bill, this is a priority for Chair Stabenow on the Senate. I mean, it's a priority for a lot of people, but Stabenow's office in particular has put a lot of work into this. There's an Office of Urban Agriculture now at the USDA because of the last Farm Bill. So that whole portfolio could always be better supported, but the infrastructure is there. And I think there's probably potential to make more progress on that. And then I think also there's a lot of interest in how do we make other programs tap into, like that's this LAMP kind of framework is interesting. So there's a particular program that's going to get a lot of love, I hope, in this Farm Bill, which is called GUSNIP. So it's named after somebody named Gus Schumacher, and the NIP is Nutrition Incentives Program. And so it's, it's, if you've ever seen a Double Up Food Bucks, or in DC, we call it Produce Plus. If you are getting SNAP, you can get some extra, your money goes further if you're buying produce. You can use it at grocery stores, but could you also use it at farmers markets? Could urban farms in that community be a source? Can we link all that up? So there's a food as medicine conversation about programs like GUSNIP. There's the Office of Urban Ag. There's these LAMP programs. I think there's potential there in this window to hopefully knit all that stuff together.
Awesome, thank you both. This next question is from Zoe from Rep Luminar's office. Could you elaborate on the environmental impact of unlimited crop insurance subsidies? Patty or Kara, do you want to take this one?
Actually,
ahead,
Dave,
Paul.
you might be better on crop insurance than me.
Well, I can just speak from a small scale rural farmer. The challenge that I have with crop insurance is that I have to purchase crop insurance 2 to 3 months before I ever plant my crop. And if I have to choose between purchasing crop insurance or purchasing seeds, I'm going to purchase seeds. And the issue that I've had, even with the NAP coverage, is that I had a claim, and the county committee came out, the inspectors said, yes, I didn't have germination, told me to cut down my crop. And then my claim was actually denied because there wasn't a drought declared, state of emergency in my county. And I'm like, what the heck? And so I'm out of a crop and I get no money, and, farmers can't survive like that. So, the fact that there is NAP coverage and there's federal crop insurance, a lot of times it's not affordable or available to the small scale producer at a time when they actually have money in their budget, because they're focusing with that 40-year high cost of seeds and fertilizer, if they're going to actually get a crop in the ground. So buying something before they even, have a crop is challenging. And then having those claims denied because the county committee actually approves those. So looking at some of those policy guidelines would be great.
Ricardo, I'll just add quickly to that there's also a misincentive in our crop insurance programs, which means that basically, very large commodity farmers can buy crop insurance for land that in a lot of cases probably shouldn't be planted to those crops, and they can gather in the federal government actually bears the vast majority of the risk. So about 62% of crop insurance, we think of crop insurance like, oh, well, you're buying insurance like we buy our car insurance. But the truth is the federal government actually picks up about 62% of the tab for most farmers' crop insurance. And by the way, that scale is unlimited. They can get as much crop insurance for as many acres as they own. So what it creates is this crisis in the industry where we're planting corn over corn over corn, or corn over soybeans, or corn over soybeans, even when that's not the best thing for the soil or the best thing for the land. And that's because if the crop fails, the insurance, or if something like climate change and a variety of issues, or weather patterns change, we still plant the crop, because if the crop fails, we can get an insurance payout. And so the truth of the matter is that we have to change the lopsided misincentive of that crop insurance program. We need a true safety net. Let me be clear. For small producers like Kara and myself and others, for smaller producers, we need a real safety net. But for those people at the top who are using crop insurance as sort of an investment protection strategy, a safeguard against losing money on their investment, we need to be sure that they have some requirements around what they have to do from an environmental standpoint, from a conservation standpoint, to make sure that they're not contributing to the climate crisis, that they're not making our pollution issues worse. So this is a really important issue, and it really comes down to that issue of consolidation. But remember, our crop insurance programs are just unchecked at the moment.
Super fast. There's not time to get into the history of farm bills and how we got here. This is playing crop insurance is playing a disproportionate role in the concept of a safety net. And you're supposed to guess how to insure yourself and all of the other stuff that we just heard about. And then a bunch of folks can't use it, can't get it. So there's a big conversation in the specialty crop, which is Farm Bill for fruits and vegetables. They don't have crop insurance largely. There's some policies, but certified organic folks struggle to make crop insurance work for them, in part because the insurance industry is like, well, we're not sure what your data is. Like, they are actuaries. We're trying to, and they've been demanding data that doesn't exist and takes too long to get and then there's a lot of folks have just been parked in something called whole farm revenue, because they're not, what we want to see, regenerative, sustainable, organic folks talk about, diversity is my insurance. If this crop gets eaten, I grew these other crops, right? Like that doesn't jive with an insurance policy that the insurance industry is ready to write. If you grow 40 things, they're not going to sell you 40 policies. So we park people in something called whole farm revenue. And the reception overall to small farmers and whole farm revenue has been like, thanks, but this is not really what I need. So it's just, and we used to do a lot more things to talk about, price floors and just what you could make selling things. A lot of that has gone away since the 80s, kind of every farm bill cuts the concept of a safety net. This is what is left. And it benefits the largest players and the insurance companies who get their profits covered by the Farm Bill.
Awesome. Thank you all. Shifting gears a little bit, to the debt limit. As we know, that's, kind of the biggest conversation in DC right now. What should we keep our eye on regarding the debt limit conversations and the Farm Bill or agriculture as a whole? Gina and Patty, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, Gina,
Start, and then I'll send it over to Patty. I'll say that, there is, the Farm Bill is a big package, and part of that is Title IV, right? Title IV is our nutrition program. That is we all operate together. And we've seen what successful farm bills in the past have done, right? Where if you even, Chair Pat Roberts in the past, right? He said, don't touch time limits. If you want to pass a strong farm bill, don't touch farm limits. And we know that with Senator Stabeno's leadership, we're hoping that will be the same thing we're having this time around. So the messaging across is we want to make sure that we shouldn't be trying to dismantle SNAP programs, kind of Medicare, like just so many other things that affect the individuals who are purchasing from our food systems, who are working in these factories, who are they themselves being in these food systems. We shouldn't make it more difficult for them to be able to purchase food, but instead we should be thinking about how to strengthen, the local economy so that these individuals can be able to participate in them, and keeping in mind that having time limits on these programs are incredibly harmful. And if that we want to make sure that there's a Farm Bill to September 30th, time limits should not be part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's huge. And I know none of our groups, even though maybe we're mostly dealing in other parts of the Farm Bill, would be okay. With SNAP. You're cutting SNAP if you make it harder to get SNAP, right? So that's a non-starter for, I think, all of the groups that we work with. And of course that they're testing out those ideas in the debt limit conversation. Yeah, and we have to write a Farm Bill, and they don't know how much money they have to spend to write it. So process-wise, it's just causing a lot of angst. There is a deadline that some folks on the House side in the Ag Committee are saying get your priorities in for your offices by the beginning of June. I think it's June 9th. So we still have to do that, although we have this debt ceiling debate hanging over us about when will they know the money so they can write the bill. But also it's all getting entangled to me because there's folks trying to kind of undermine progress happening in the administration. We have an executive order from the president about promoting competition in the American economy and finishing rulemaking that should have been finished a decade ago to enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act. And so that's not in the debt limit fight yet, but it's in, the bill that passed out of the subcommittee in appropriations this morning. And it is an ungodly list of ugly in that House appropriations bill that would roll back tons of progress on, loan forgiveness, climate, just a ton of progress being able to start the ball rolling at USDA and various mechanisms, debt limit fight, appropriations process. We hope not the Farm Bill are just being kind of like lobbed at that progress to stop it. So I think the debt limit obviously matters for the process and the amount of money available for the Farm Bill, but it's also kind of a proving ground, I think, for bad ideas that we might have to fight in various other bills.
Ricardo, do you mind if I add just one thing to that?
Sure, yeah, very briefly, please.
I would just say that the one thing to look at, one additional thing besides all those things that were just said, if we see some sort of an agreement for across the board cut from this debt ceiling fight, we know which programs are going to get cut first, right? Those programs that support small farmers, that support higher welfare, animal agriculture, those who are raising animals on pasture, those that are supporting urban agriculture, those that are supporting our farmers of color. So this is a fight around the debt ceiling that we have to have, because the programs that support folks like us are the ones that are going to get cut if there are mandatory cuts. And it's just unfortunate that others in the system have enough power to make that sort of happen. But ultimately, this is our fight because our programs are small and often the first on the chopping block. So just be very aware that if we have to see across the board cuts at places like USDA, that's going to hurt folks that are in your constituency and that we care about.
Thank you all for that. This has been a great conversation. We are 1 minute over, so I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. Next week, you'll receive an email with a link to a recording of this presentation portion of this call, and a Google Doc full of resources on how you can join the fight for a farm bill that protects small farmers, hungry families, and our land, water, and food systems. If you got a starting now email and you clicked on a Zoom link, or in other words, if your name was participant when you logged on instead of your name, you still need to register to attend the other trainings and to be sure that we have your email to send you the toolkit. Make sure you sign up so that you can also get all the great tools and resources we talked about today, and the recording of this webinar as well. We'll be sending reminders out for future briefings, along with great resources and other tools, so be sure to register. Thank you all once again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks for being with us. Take care.
Thank you.